So my name's Mark. For those of you that know me, that's my middle name, but my full name's Shannon Egan. And I use my full name when I do presentations. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I didn't grow up as an Adventist. I grew up in New Orleans, which is pretty much the reverse of being an Adventist, right? So I tell everybody it's the reverse Adventist diet. So I grew up eating, crabs, shrimp, crawfish, alligators, squirrel, a lot of pork, a lot of sugar. In fact, New Orleans is famous for its delicious food. It's some of the tastiest food in the world. But interestingly, it also has the highest cancer rate of any other city per capita in the world. So the reverse of the Adventist diet seems to lead to cancer. So I was raised in a Pentecostal church, and I was very active there in Bible classes, Sunday school classes. I spent 4 or 5 hours every Sunday. My mom made me do that. I didn't really want to do it, but I'm thankful for that because that became an integral part of me. And I memorized entire books of the Bible, of the New Testament, hundreds of scriptures. But it's ironic because I never understood what a lot of it meant. And that irony was clear to me as I was studying this. And I don't know what this stuff means, and nobody else did either, really, right? So when you're not being taught the right things, it's hard to understand the Bible. You can't see the woods through the forest. So when you're given, for example, the words soul and spirit, the majority of the Christian world uses the pagan definitions of those words. They don't use the biblical definitions of those words. So when you read the Bible, it seems to be very conflicting and confusing, and so there seems to be a veil over your eyes in a lot of these churches because of what you're taught. And so even though I tried to understand the Bible, and I did, I studied it, and I had concordance, I still couldn't understand it. So I have sympathy for people in those religions they're trying to learn this stuff. To us, it's very obvious. When you grow up in Adventist, you're like, why can't you see it? But it's just not the case because you grow up with a completely different mindset. So from 93 to 97, I was in the United States Marine Corps. I served as a light armored vehicle mechanic, and I was stationed in 29 Palms, California, and deployed to Okinawa, Japan, and North Korea. And I've got a lot of stories from there as well. I've got a lot of testimonials from different times of my life, so I'm not going to cover everything. So when I got out of the Marine Corps, I attended University of New Orleans and studied as a mechanical engineer. And so I was 30 years old at the time, and that's when I went to an Amazing Facts seminar. I believe it was in the year 2000. And so for the first time, I began to understand the Bible, and all those scriptures and everything just came alive in my mind. And God brought to my mind those memories as I was in the seminar. And I can remember different times, having questions, especially about the state of the dead. And God made himself very real to me at that time, and I realized God watches over us. Like when you're sitting in church right now, God's watching you. There's a record of it. There's angels, and the heavenlies they're paying attention. And so God led me to the truth over those years. That's what He was showing me. And so even though it took 20 years or so in God's timing, it was perfect for me to learn it at that time. And I think I appreciate the Adventist theology a lot more, having gone through that. And it's really not Adventist theology, it's biblical teachings, right? So I don't like the word church doctrines. I hear people say it at different churches. It's either a biblical teaching or it's not, So the Bible says the scriptures of no private interpretation, right? And so that tells you it's not loosey-goosey. It's just the way that people study. Most Christians out there study at the 10,000-foot level. And at 10,000-foot level, that's where conspiracies live, right? That's where false information lives. You have to dig down deeper to get the truth, and it's not very difficult. But I find that to be a problem a lot today in the world. I mean, with politics and news, people just don't dig to find the truth, and it's not very difficult, especially in the internet and Google. You can find the truth to anything in 5 to 10 minutes. You just got to spend just a little bit of time. So we live in a very interesting time. And so one of the things that particularly that made a big difference in my life was the state of the dead. So I grew up being taught in that church about hell, how God was going to torture people for all eternity. And that really weighed on my mind. And as a child, to hear that over and over again, it kind of messes you up, messes up your psychology. And it's really toxic. You know, a definition of a toxic relationship is when somebody says one thing but does another thing, or says two different things at the same time, right? So to say that God's a loving God and the most loving God on earth, and at the same breath say he's going to torture a 13-year-old for all eternity because he missed an altar call, that's not consistent in any logical way. And so when you listen to some of these atheists talk, and the reason they reject religion is just that, because there's no logical consistency there. And I don't blame them as far as that goes. They're actually doing the right thing, because it's not healthy to be toxic. Where they fault, though, where they fail, is that they assume that what they're hearing about God in the Bible is true, and they haven't investigated for themselves. So the final judgment and what happens to the wicked, we all know that in the Bible it tells us the wicked are destroyed, they perish, they're reduced to ashes, they experience the second death. The book of Revelation says that 3 times. It actually calls it the second death. You're not tortured forever. So the results of the decision and the consequences are what remain forever, but the punishment does not last forever. So I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And there's a number of scriptures that say that. So the alternative is perishing or living forever. And perish means perish. It's a cessation of life. Death means death. And destruction means, destruction. Those words don't have alternate meanings. Some words in the Bible do have different meanings, but those words, they always mean the same thing. So in 2003, I came up to Michigan to get a job in the defense industry, and I've been working there over 20 years as a mechanical engineer. And I work on a maintenance design of different armored vehicles and tanks. I do a lot of things there, write operator manuals, review drawings, give presentations to the government. My first week in Michigan, I spent attending Sabbath services in this very, very church. And I remember looking through the phone book, which is, do you remember that? It was like a thick, the yellow pages, right? It was the yellow pages. I remember flipping through there, looking under Seventh-day Adventist, and then finding this church. And so my first weekend, I actually spent here, and I became a member here like 20 years ago. Since then, I've moved around a lot. I went to Virginia, and right now I'm living in Dryden. I just sold my house about a week ago. Dryden is about 35 miles northish. And so right now I'm looking for a place to stay. I'm in between a lot of things, juggling a lot of things, working full time. So the other thing I've been active with, I have started preaching sermons in churches, and about a half a dozen of those I've preached at a Methodist church in Dryden, local church. So God gave me an opportunity to preach some sermons there, and I believe my first sermon there was the same title, Worship God, Creator of the Heavens and Earth, and I teach Sunday school there. And that's been a very good opportunity. And I'm glad that I'm involved with that church. I also teach AA classes there during the week. So I want to talk about worship and creation and how I came to understand those things in my life. I came to understand creation not at an amazing facts seminar, but actually in a public university, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit later. So what is worship? So worship is defined as the expression of reverence, appreciation, adoration, and recognition for a deity. And so we can worship God in a lot of different ways. We can worship God through the song worship, like we did. We had the song service. We can also do this through appreciation and gratitude towards God, which is a form of worship. So you're acknowledging the gifts that God gives you. So showing gratitude towards God is really interesting because in my AA classes, we're taught, and I teach AA classes, we tell people to express gratitudes every morning towards God, and that keeps you from being depressed. And I recently, I heard about that. So there's a documentary on a famous therapist, and he talks about gratitude. And if the first thing that he tells his clients is that very thing. Like every morning, say gratitudes, and the way he puts it is, it pierces the clouds of darkness and allows, God's rays to shine into your soul. And it's really interesting to hear him say that because this guy, he's very famous with celebrities and things of that nature. So even they know how to, keep from being depressed, and that's showing gratitude towards God. Studying and marveling at God's works is also a form of worship. And so the scripture reading for today in Psalms 92:5 says, how great are your works, right? So David saying that, how great are your works, implies that he's thinking about creation. He's studying it. That's why he's saying, how great are your works, right? So studying creation, studying nature, puts you in touch with God, and that's one of the things that we do on Sabbath is think about those things. And I'm always thinking about those things. When I look at animals, is thinking about the complexity and how God put everything together. So why do we worship God? Why worship God? Well, God, at its core, God deserves our worship because He is our creator. Okay, He's the creator and also the sustainer of the things in heaven and earth. And a lot of people miss that, the sustainer. But the more you study the things in nature and science, you realize there seems to be a divine presence that is keeping everything in check, right? We read the following from the Bible, who being the brightness of His glory and express image of His person, and upholding all things by the word of His power, when He Himself had purged our sins, sat down on majesty at high. So that's talking about Jesus Christ, upholding all things by the word of His power. So without God, the universe wouldn't keep running. It seems like a bold statement, but if you look at the universe, you see how remarkable, how impossibly precise every condition has to be for it to occur, and how finely tuned it is. And there's also, there's things in the earth, there's mechanisms that when one thing goes too far one way, it compensates and goes the other way. And a lot of things we don't even understand. So one example is the sun, right? We look at the sun, and it's fueled by nuclear energy. It's the same, it's having thermonuclear explosions, the same as nuclear blasts, right? So you wonder, why doesn't it just explode outward? Well, the force of explosion is perfectly counteracted by the mass and the weight of the sun. And so it just sits there in a stable fashion, and those numbers are just remarkably precise. The other thing about the sun that's interesting is that when you look at other stars in the same weight and size class, the sun is very unique. It's very different. The stars, they'll expand and contract 10 to 15% a couple times a month. And when that happens, if our sun was to do that, it would kill everything on Earth a couple times every month. We couldn't live. So there's something about the sun that it's incredibly stable. No other star in the same class is like that. And there's some other features about the sun, like the metals and things that, science astronomers are studying, and it's very interesting. And so in Revelation, it tells us, chapter 16, 8, 9, when the fourth angel poured out his vial upon his son, power was given unto him to scorch men with fire, and men were scorched with great heat. When I read that, I think about that fact about the sun, and I wonder if, that plague isn't simply God removing his sustaining power from the sun and letting it behave like it normally does. So it's a possibility. And the other thing is the Earth's magnetic fields. The Earth's magnetic fields is very finely tuned. There's a lot of things. It's very complex, and it shields us from the rays of the sun and from the solar winds. The other example is molecular machines. And so these things are very fascinating. Within the cells, there are these molecular machines, and they build all the components of the cell. And the way they do this is they read the DNA, they read instructions from the DNA like blueprints, like construction blueprints, and they make these different structures of the cell. And so these molecular machines depend on DNA to get these instructions. What's also interesting is that these molecular machines, they're built by other molecular machines, which also need DNA, and DNA needs to be built by molecular machines. So all these things are intertwined. There's no way for these things to kind of come about at the same time. For this, I included a link on here. This is a snapshot of what's called a dynein motor. And on the right there, you can see this shape. And those two things that look like legs and feet, those actually are legs and feet. It walks across this tubule, and it's carrying something. It's got like a backpack. And at that level, it's actually walking across at 300 miles an hour. And it also knows when to step over the other machines called kinesins, which walk in the opposite direction. So when it sees them, it steps over them. And these machines appear to make decisions, and they know where to go. They don't have brains. So what is causing them to do all this? What is orchestrating this? So I believe it's God. I believe God at the level of these things, and like quarks that do really weird things, that there's a divine presence that's keeping all this stuff active. And I believe that's what it means by sustaining power. Here's another example of a flagellum motor from a bacterium. And that whip you see is like a tail. It's like a propeller, and it actually spins. And these things live in the cell walls of the bacteria. And you can see it on a microscope. It looks like these little whips just spinning around, and it actually swims. It's actually able to swim and direct its path, through fluids. And when you cut a cross section of this, it's very analogous to an electrical motor. There's a stator, there's a rotor. It uses chemical fuel as energy. It's 100% efficient. And when you think about this thing, it's amazing because it took men thousands of years to come up with an electrical motor. And here's this thing, at that level is an actual motor using chemicals to fuel itself. So how do you think something like that just came about? And these molecular machines, when they build it, that's even more remarkable. They build it from the inside out in a certain sequence, right? They put this thing together. And these molecular machines, they can transform. They can turn into other machines depending on a task. And so the more we look into God's creation, the more fascinating it becomes. And we know from the 1800s, in the 1800s, there was a prophet called Ellen White that says, throughout all eternity in heaven, we will be learning about God's works. And I look forward to that. And she says there will never be an end to it. So heaven's not going to be boring. It's going to be fascinating. We'll be learning about all these things. And I believe God is making all these things real. In the past 10 years, there's been more evidence that supports a divine intelligence and creator than any other time in history. And it's so overwhelming, both in astronomy and at this level, that it's just so undeniable. No matter how many assumptions scientists make and change, they're in a place right now where they can't come up with explanations for things like this. Think about the wide variety of foods on Earth. Imagine if we didn't have blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, cranberries, beans, rice, so many other things. You look at cattle; they eat hay every day, and they love it. Like, they eat the same thing every day. And that's amazing to me. But if God, simply wanted us to survive, He didn't need to create all these things. The diversity of life is astonishing. You could have just made a couple of simple, food groups. So He makes all these things for our enjoyment, not just for our survival. It's for our appreciation. And I'm always thinking about things like that, blueberries and just the different textures, the different flavors. And even evolutionists are amazed at the diversity of life on Earth. It's more than just survival. There's a lot more there. So He put it here for our enjoyment. So I mentioned I was a mechanical engineering student in a university in New Orleans. This is really when I became a creationist, believe it or not. And at the time, I was on the fence about creation and evolution. I had read about creation in the Bible, and I wanted to believe it, but I didn't know the evidence for it, and I was a little bit worried that maybe it wasn't true. But sitting in those classes at UNO, I saw how impossible it is for there not to be a creator, right? So in one of my classes, I learned about something called the law of biogenesis. So it's the only law in biology, and basically it states that living life forms can only come from other existing life forms. Now think about that for a second. It's a law, and it's saying that life can only come from other life. So what does evolution say? It says that life came from inorganic things, right? So in science, a theory has to align with all the known laws of science. If it doesn't align with the known laws of science, it's not a theory. So according to that definition, which is a scientific definition, it's not a theory. And I don't know why people call it a theory, because it's not. It violates all the definitions of a theory. It's conjecture at best. Evolution believes in miracles, and they tell you it's backed on science, but the laws of science don't agree with it. Okay, so evolutionists believe in miracles without a miracle worker. I believe in miracles with a miracle worker. There's no inconsistency there, right? So which is more logical and which is more absurd? It's not absurd what we believe. There's no problems there. The things that we see are miracles. But to be a scientist and say we believe in all these miracles, but then even science doesn't back it up. Now what are you saying? If science doesn't back it up, that to me it's a little bit of insanity. And there's other laws that it violates too, like the first and second laws of thermodynamics. I won't go into those because I've got a lot left. All right. So in biology class one day, and ironically enough, I was in biology class on the Sabbath when this happened to me, okay? I forgot about this part of the story. So I wasn't an Adventist yet. I was attending biology class on the Sabbath, and I learned about the complexity of the blood clotting mechanisms. And our instructor was telling us how all these different mechanisms, these like 7 different systems come together, and they organize and they orchestrate. And one of these things is like a net that gets thrown over, and there's all these other different factors that come into play. And I'm sitting here thinking about it, and thought occurred to me. I'm like, how could we evolve? Or how could this evolve? And I shot up my hand, and I normally don't ask questions. At that time, I was kind of shy. But I asked her, I said, could something like this evolve? And I remember her answer very well, because she was a French lady, and she said flatly, no, it could not. And then she turned around and she walked to the front of the office. She stopped the lecture, and it kind of rattled her. I don't know why. I don't know if she was worried that she had said that, or maybe she was a Christian, or maybe she was an atheist. I don't know. But it was interesting. And at that moment, there was a thought that occurred to me that said, I'm God, I'm real, I made everything. And I felt God's presence. And at that moment, I knew, I was like, wow, God made all this. It became real to me. So I would say I became a creationist on the Sabbath day in a public institution, learning from a science book. Okay? So God taught me about creation, I feel, and he opened my eyes to these things. So as Bible-believing Christians, we see that it's our responsibility to worship God as the Creator, is the observance of the Sabbath. This is why it's connected to the creation story. And so when I tell you about that, going back to that story about being in UNO and learning about creation, this was about 6 months before I went to the Amazing Facts seminar and then learned about Sabbath. And I believe that the way that I learned it, I learned creation first, and then the Sabbath made Sabbath even more real to me. If I had not known that about creation, I don't believe you can keep the Sabbath if you don't believe in creation, because you're not keeping it in faith. If creation isn't real, Sabbath isn't real. It's part of the same story. And I think a lot of people, there's some people who try to observe the Sabbath, but in their minds they're conflicted about creation. I think that really ruins your experience with God, because the Bible says God is a spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. And if you have doubts about creation, then you have doubts about God, because at its core, God is the creator. That's who he is. And so to deny that is to deny God. And God cares about these things. He's a loving being. It's kind of odd when people think those things don't affect him. If we're in a real relationship with God, and he knows that you don't believe in creation, then he knows that you don't believe he's the creator. And that's going to affect the relationship. It's a two-way street. It's not just one way. It's not just us. It's relating to God and recognizing him, giving the recognition and admiration that he deserves. And so we see the Sabbath in creation. It's an intentional memorial by the God of creation. A lot of you probably heard about Earth Day, right? That happens once a year. The world, it seems that they worship the earth, right? They don't give God the credit as a creator, and it's every year it's called Earth Day, right? They worship the created and not the creator. They don't give recognition to God for that. So in my mind, Sabbath is the true Earth Day, right? And it happens every week. We do Earth Day every 7 days. And so it's our special connection with God. It's based on a weekly creation cycle. And by the way, the 7-day cycle isn't based on anything in the heavens or astronomy. It comes from creation week. It comes from the Bible. The month is based on a lunar cycle. The year is based on the sun, the Earth's circuit around the sun. But the 7-day cycle, there's no explanation for it. There's nothing except for the Bible. So God has kept that intact for us. There's no other explanation for it. So I'm going to go through these scriptures real quick, because I'm running a little bit behind. So I want to show you, for those that are listening, I'm going to flash some scriptures that shows the Sabbath throughout the Bible. And we see Sabbath in the Old Testament, but we see it before it was given to Moses. And we also see it in the New Testament. And we see it in the new heavens and the new earth in several places, and we see it in the book of Revelation. And so I wanted to go through that a bit. And so we all know the Old Testament Sabbath references. In Exodus 28 through 11, in the last part, I'm going to read you the last part of that scripture. I think it's verses 10 and 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So why do we keep Sabbath day? Because God rested the Sabbath day and he hallowed it. It doesn't say we keep Sabbath because of the resurrection of Christ, right? I can make the same argument and say, well, the death and resurrection is proof of Sabbath because Christ rested in the grave through Sabbath. So that's an endorsement of Sabbath, but we don't keep Sabbath because of that. We keep it because God rested from his works and he hallowed the day. That's why we keep it. And this was told to Moses. It was told to millions of Israelites by God himself with his own voice. And when he gave the law, he gave it on top of the mountain, Mount Sinai, with fire and with thunderings and shaking and his voice. He wanted to get a point across that he was given this law, and the only person that can change this law is God himself in the same way. And we don't see that anywhere else in Scripture. It was never changed. God gave the law, only God can change it. And so we see, I like this passage in Hebrews 4 through 11. Because some Christians say, well, Sabbath change, we have proof from the book of Acts, which isn't true. There's no proof in the book of Acts about that, and I could go into that, but I don't even want to touch on that because Paul wrote Acts, Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. So if Paul talks about Sabbath in Hebrews, that means that the book of Acts didn't change the Sabbath, right? Hebrews came after the book of Acts. For he spoke in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For those that are you listening, there remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God, for he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his works, as God did from his. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. So it's clearly talking about the Sabbath, and it gives the same reason for the Sabbath, because God rested from his works. There's nothing in there about it was changed because of resurrection. And when we look at Revelation 4:14 through 7, verse 7, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. This is a reference back to Exodus chapter 20, verses 8-11. It's the same language. And how do we worship the Creator? By worshiping God on the Sabbath. So right there in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible is a reference to the Sabbath. And so we also see the Sabbath mentioned in the new heavens and the new earth, that from one Sabbath to another, from one moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And I left out the first part. It says, for as the new heavens and the new earth. So it's clearly talking about the new heavens and new earth. Revelation 21, 1 through 4. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Right? So this is talking about the same place. So now I'm going to show you some creations from God, and these are real photos. When I first saw these, I thought they were fake. I thought they were Photoshopped. I'm like, this isn't real. But I dug into these. I've got a lot of references, and I promise you, these are real. These are real birds, and they really do look like this. These are not Photoshopped. So something I want you to keep in mind when you look at these birds and these insects, that they're brightly colored creatures. They're not colored for camouflage. So evolution tells you that everything is built for survival. Then why is this red and blue and purple? Do you ever see a tree of those colors? Right? So a lot of these things, they stand out. They stand out very starkly against the background. And so there's no reason for them to be there, that color, for survivability. And in fact, the opposite, they stand out for predators, right? But God protects them so that we can observe them and enjoy them. Again, the creation life seems to be made for our enjoyment and not simply for survivability. And I think about, everybody knows parents that before their baby even comes to the earth, they make it a baby room, they paint it, they put all these nice things in there, they put decorations in there, and the baby doesn't even know what's going on. But why do they do it? Because they love their child, and they want their child to look at something nice. They want their child to be surrounded by beautiful things, right? And so this is the way I think of their earth. God made this beautiful because he loves us, and he wants us to appreciate these things, and he wants us to be surrounded by beauty, not just simply things for our survival. So this is called a quetzal. This is a quetzal bird. This is a golden pheasant. And I put the location in here so you guys know it's not fake. There's like zoos and things in China where you can see these things. And look at this bird. If you were to draw an outline sketch of this and give it to an artist and say, make this beautiful, he couldn't make it any beautiful than that. I mean, look at the detail and a different color and the different layers. What's the purpose for that? Some people say, well, they need that to be able to mate. I might buy into that, except there's a lot of birds that are just brown or gray or black, just basic colors. Horses are brown. You don't need color for, to mate. People are not multicolored, and we do okay, right? So it's not necessary for reproduction. It is true that some of these animals, I believe God put in them to look for mates that represent their species. And so those things don't get washed out through adoptability. Let me talk about adoptability for a second. I forgot to talk about that. Adoptability is something that happens within a species. Okay, so something I just found out is that within a species, the animal, like a cat, has all the genes necessary to make it a lion. And a lion has all of the same genes as a cat, right? Most of our genes are turned off, and this was, for a while, this was called junk DNA. They didn't realize what it was, but these are variations. So within a species, there is the potential for it to adapt to its circumstances. It's already there. It just switches off and on, okay? That's not evolution. That's adaptability within a species. Evolution is when you go from one animal type to a different animal type. This is a mandarin duck, which is found in China, Japan, southern England. This one always amazes me. You can't see it too good in here, but some of these ducks, they have like a small ring of orange around their eye, like somebody painted it. So you can find a lot of images like this. Even in the insect world, this is a pink orchid mantis, and the mantises have a tremendous variety. You Google it, different types of mantises. There's all kinds of different types. And that's a moth, a rosy maple moth. I mean, look, it looks fake, but this is real. God really made these things. So let me finish with a quote from Psalms chapter 8. So it gives the reasons for our worship of God as a true creator. Psalms 8, 1 through 9. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea,